So this video relates to the first session, and in particular is an introduction to some of the functions that are built into Excel. To help me with that, I've made a very small workbook that I've put available online. You can see the beginning of it here. As I fill it in, I'll save the final version online with all of the working formulae in it. I'll talk through all of the functions that we discussed in the lecture. I'll also add, there's a couple more that might be useful that people have asked about in previous years that I'll add in as we go as well, but not many. So I've set this workbook out a bit like a mark sheet I might use for some of your coursework. So we've got a series of IDs and a series of marks for a piece of work, and if we add a second set of marks for a second piece of work, say, so quite varied marks there. If we demonstrate just some of the simple functions to begin with, so to start with sum, what does sum do? I think most people were familiar with this one. So I type sum, I open the brackets. For every function, if you've spelt it right, Excel recognises it, it will put up a small box where you're typing, and it will tell you how it wants you to structure the rest of that command. So as I open the brackets, I know that I can add different numbers into my brackets and then close the brackets, and that will run that sum function. Anything in a square bracket, so you can see number 2 is in a square bracket, the word number 2. That means it's optional. So you can have just one single reference or number in here and it will add it. So for us, we could say this cell, and this cell, and this cell. Close the brackets, and it's added those together. And to select individual separate cells, I was holding down Control on the keyboard as well. If I wanted to select a range of cells, instead I can highlight that whole area there. And that's added together the marks for that whole column, C3 all the way down to C12. And if I click back in the cell, it highlights it in the same colour that the text is in the function bar. So that shows you sum. It also shows you a short range. So in the slide it was actually A1 to 5, but we've used C3 to C12 because that's where my data is. So that's a range from C3 to C12. If I was to change that so we could have another one here, let's do that again. There's two other ranges that were shown in the piece we were looking at. In the table on slide, I believe it's slide 37 of the lecture, there was A:A, so that's again defining a range. And you can see that's highlighted the whole of column A. Now at the moment there's nothing in column A. So if we change that to column B, it's added everything in column B, all the way from the top all the way to the bottom of the sheet. And that will keep updating if I add more numbers in there. Okay, I'm going to move that just out of the way slightly. So that's added all of column B. I could add all of column B and column C. So that's all of column B to all of column C. And you can see it's highlighted in blue again. So it's just defining different ranges. Okay, and if I add anything to either of those columns, it will add them up now. If we go back a little way, we jumped a couple there in the table. So there was one that was an if statement. So how do I use if? So I might want to say here, pass or fail. So who's passed the course? Now, the pass mark for all of your modules is 40%. Let's assume the pass mark for each piece of work is 40% to keep it simple to start with. So equals if. So I'm asking a question. The first bit says logic test. So logic test, if this mark, C3, is greater than 40, comma. I've put a comma, which means now I'm into the second bit of my statement. So what value do I want it to be if true? So when I put the comma, you can see before the comma, this piece, this logical test phrase is bold, comma, now the value if true is bold. So I can put some text in there. So open some quotation marks, pass, comma, value if false. So what do I want it to show if it's not greater than 40? So if C3 is greater than 40, it will show pass. If it's less than 40 or equal to 40, it will show fail. Now that should give me a fail. Good. Even if I change that to 40, that will still be fail because it's not greater than 40. So actually we want greater than 39 because 40 would be a pass. Okay, so if C3 is greater than 39, show pass, else show fail. And you can put lots of these if statements inside each other if you really want to. So you can have one test, shows one thing, show one phrase, then you can have another if statement here with another test in it to show a second text box, text string. We've also got the $sign, which a lot of people seemed unfamiliar with. I'm going to show that with the next command VLOOKUP, and I'm going to show VLOOKUP with the $sign and without it to compare what it does. So if we just copy that down to see if they've passed. There we go. So I can copy this down, and you can see in the next cell down it's changed C3 to C4. And all the way at the bottom it's changed it to C12, so it's still looking at the correct row. I might want to VLOOKUP to look up a particular student's marks. So I might want to go down a little bit below my my table of data, and I might want to say here I might type a number. So this number is exactly the same as this number in row 7. And I might want to say that's my the student I want to look up. So I then want to say equals VLOOKUP. So it's going to look up what value do I want it to look up. I want to look up this value, comma, table array. So where do I want it to look? Well, I want it to look in this table here. It will only look in the first column of the table, comma, column index number, so it looks up this value, this blue cell here, it looks it up in the red table. The column index number is which column do I want it to return when it finds that number. So if I want to know the mark it got for the second piece of coursework, then that would be in the third column of this table. So I'll put the 3 in there. Now, I look down, I find that number, in the third column there's 49. So that's worked, that's fine. There was a fourth option. So if I put comma here, there is a fourth bit to it, where you can say true or false. If you leave it blank, if you just left it as it was, it will find an approximate match. If I put comma, oops, and true, sorry, comma and false, and spell false, right, it will give me an exact match. So that's still exactly the same for this case. Where I might use that is if I've got lots of data in the table and the ID numbers were numbers to a certain number of decimal places, then it would return the exact value rather than the closest one that it found near the top of the table. So for instance, if I was looking for pi, if this cell was pi 3.14159, etc., and it found 3.142 right at the top, it might return that one instead. I want an exact match because I want to know exactly what this student got with this ID. Okay. If I wanted to look up a second student, Whoops. So I've now got a second student ID. If I just copy this down, then it does work, but there's a problem. In fact, if I change the ID to be the top person, we'll see the problem. It's now saying there's an error. So if we look at what was in our first cell, we've got VLOOKUP B26 in B3 to D12 and show me the column 3, the second mark. If I look at what I've got when I've copied it down, I'm looking up B27, that's fine, but I'm looking it up in B4 to D13. My range has moved. As I've copied down, the cell I want to look up has moved, as too has the range. It's all moved down a cell because I've moved down one cell. So if we go back to our original, we can tell it to fix its reference, to stick certain parts. So I could tell it to stick the rows, because we want the rows to remain the same. We still want it to look between B3 and D12. Okay, so if I do that, this number will be the same. This one here, it was B4 to D13. When I copy it down, it remains B3 to D12. So the $sign freezes or sticks, because it looks a little bit like an S, that's why I use stick, freezes certain parts of that cell reference. If I want to copy it sideways, if I was to drag it across, it will look up in C3 to E12. Well, C3 to E12, well, there's nothing useful there. So I can stick the columns as well, so I can put extra $signs in. However, when I drag it over, it still won't work, because if I'm looking up the value 49 in this table, there's no 49 in that first column. So there's the reason we have an error now is there's no 49 in this table in this first column to look up. Okay, so that's actually doing nothing. The next few, we've got left, right, and in fact there is a third function called mid. So left, right, and mid are useful for example, I've used them for your statics coursework, which I'll introduce you to in the next module, in the statics module. I've used left, right, and mid to take parts of your student ID and set variables for different coursework questions. So, whoops, if we type left, I can use the left command. What text do I want to look at? So we'll take your student ID, comma. How many characters do I want to read? Let's take the first 2 characters from the left. That's a 1 and a 0. So let me label that left, mid, right. If I wanted to take the middle characters, which are going to be zeros in this case, what text? This one. Where do I want to start? There's an extra option here. Which character do I want to start at? Well, let's start at character, doesn't make much difference because they're all zeros, character 4, and let's go for 2 more characters, so that should be 2 zeros. And similarly right is similar to left, but it reads from the right hand side, so we'll take the same text and we'll read 2 characters from the right. So from the right that should be 0, 1. And it is. Okay, so fairly straightforward there. Next couple, we've got several cells that do similar things. So I could have, we've got count if, we've got count A, and we've got count blank. So count if first of all. So I could have, at the bottom, I want to make a little summary chart of who's passed a piece of work. So pass, fail, equals count if range. Well, I want this range here, that's the range I'm counting in. How many cells contain what criteria, and I want to be greater than 39. What have I done? So forgot to say, when we're putting a criteria in on its own, we have to put it in quotation marks. Okay. So I can see that in this range C3 to C12, 7 people have got greater than 39. So 7 passes. Perhaps I might want to count the failures as well, so another COUNTIF, range here, same range, criteria less than 40. Again, same mistake, put the criteria in quotation marks. Okay. Perhaps one person didn't submit some work, so maybe this person here didn't submit. So I might want to know number of submissions. Let's drag that across. So equals count A tells me how many in this range, how many cells have got text, have got content. So 9 cells have content. Okay, so 7 people passed, 2 people failed, that's 9 people. There were 9 submissions. That adds up. We haven't done anything silly. It's a good logic check. Number of non-submissions. So I could say, I could count all my student IDs and subtract all my submissions. Or I could say, count blank. If I count blank in the same range, it should tell me there's a blank cell, so I know one person didn't submit. So it's literally just looking for blank cells in that particular range. The final one that that we talked about briefly with a couple of people, and I thought I'd include it for interest, is COUNTIF-S. So we can say equals COUNTIF-S. So in this function we have a criteria range 1 and another criteria. So we can say how many people in this range, criteria range 1, comma, are greater than 39, comma, and now we have another criteria range and another criteria. So I can also say how many people in this criteria range, comma, greater than 39, close brackets. So 3 people got more than 39 in both pieces of work. So 3 people passed both pieces of work. Okay, and that's COUNTIF-S. So you're able to add more criteria to more ranges. If you want, you can add more criteria to the same range. You just have to define C3 to C12 again. Okay, and it would make that blue again. Okay, so that's COUNTIF-S. We might also want to do some more analysis. So what was the best piece of work and what was the worst piece of work? So min and max. Again, fairly straightforward. So min and your range. So the lowest mark was 25. It's not included 0 in that. And what was the best piece? And that was 95. So a good range there, but min and max fairly straightforward to use. I'm going to stop the video there, so call that the first half, just so that things are easier to find. So that concludes the first video with the first half of the introduction to Excel functions. I'll carry on editing this spreadsheet in a second video which looks down the second column and how the second column of functions work.